One. Hello, welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for my first webinar of the year. I believe Skybound's first webinar of the year as well. And I can see there's a whole host of you joined, mainly from the countries we audience to, Spain and Portugal. But actually, I can see there's a few joiners, perhaps from other European countries in the UK as well. So I'm just going to share my screen and we shall get started. So today's webinar is primarily focused around some of the new rules that were brought into place last year on the budgets, mainly the Labour budget in autumn, their first one since 2010. So there was some key changes I want to discuss, and with that, also how the changes could be affecting some of you British expats living overseas. And then, of course, at the end, I'll discuss some wealth planning around these changes. But to open things up, as always, and forgive me for the names I can see on this webinar who attend my webinars often, but I'm going to do a quick Skybound introduction so that everyone knows who we are and who I am that's on the call. We'll then just go through some of the Labour autumn budgets changes from 2024 last year. But with that, I'll really be honing in on three key changes. Um, for anyone that's not attended my webinars before, just so you're aware, I tend to keep my webinars quite short and focused on certain aspects, which I think keeps it more engaging and keeps it more relevant. So if you have any questions that are left unanswered this evening, that's no problem. Just feel free to drop myself an email or a call at the end, and I'll be happy to run through some of those other aspects with you on a separate meeting. So we'll look at the Labour autumn budget. We'll then look at the key changes that I feel should be recognised by particularly high net worth British expats living overseas. And then again, as I mentioned before, some wealth planning tips to think and consider. Right, so my background, my name's obviously Ryan Edward Donaldson. I've worked with Skybound Wealth now for coming up to my 11th year with the company. Started in the UK. I'm a UK-based financial planner. I'm chartered fellow with the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investments, so fully qualified UK, have been for that 11 years. But since then, I've worked all over Europe. I worked in Brussels, a lot in France. I was based in Geneva for 6 years. I then moved back to the UK, and now most of my client bank is based in the Swiss region, Portugal, and south of Spain. You tend to find that a lot of my retired clients tend to retire in the quite similar places. It's either nice ski places in Switzerland, it's south of Spain for the sun, or Portugal for the sun and perhaps the tax regimes, or they go back to UK. So that's what I focus on. That's where I'm registered. I'm fully European, registered qualified. I'm fully Swiss, registered qualified, and fully UK. So these are the three areas that I focus my financial planning around. Skybound Wealth, the company that I work for, short and sweet, we've got offices based all over the world. The only thing that matters to all of you on the call is to understand that each area we operate, we are regulated locally. So if we are discussing some of your UK-based financial planning, whether that's ISAs, capital gains tax rollovers, whether it's self-invested personal contributions, managing SIPs or investment vehicles, investment bonds, drawing down income, inheritance tax planning, all of that would come under the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA. However, if I'm advising you on things to do with structuring in Europe, that comes under MiFID II, under our license, and the same with Switzerland, that would be either ARIF or FINMA. We carry two regulations there. And then it goes global. I mean, I'm not a specialist in the other jurisdictions per se. I have had experience, but I've obviously got colleagues, 18 advisors in Europe who specialise in different aspects. We're regulated by the SEC in the US. We're regulated by ESCA and insurance authorities in the Middle East, and even further afield down to South Africa as well. And this is documented on this slide here. One thing I'll say at Skybound is what we do is we're an independent financial planning company. So what that means is that we don't have Skybound pensions or investment funds. My job typically is to understand your position, come up with a key strategy on how your structure should be made within the realms of local tax treatment, where your assets are based tax treatment, double taxation treatment. We use tax specialists to do that strategy report, and then I come back with structures and advice to fit with your plan. So we work with, you know, life insurance companies, tax advisors, lawyers, litigation specialists. We work with, things like just life bonds, investment bonds, different types of investment savings plans. Of course, ISAs UK, HNWIs, France, your pillar system in Switzerland, you're down in Spain and Portugal. Quite often you use annuity pensions and again, Spanish and Portuguese bonds. So we work with every aspect is the long and short of it. One thing I will say is I am not a tax specialist. Um, my qualifications are in wealth management and structuring. So the reason I say that is because we work with tax specialists, and some of the tax specialists here on the next page. I mean, listen, we've got a portfolio of partners of about 20 tax specialists in different countries. But some of the key ones we work with, of course, are Abro Marquis, which are based down in Portugal. We've got TFO, Atlantic Property Tax Consultants, which again is in Portugal. TFO, KPMG is UK and global. Some other ones that we work with is Cutricacas Goncalves Pereira for any Spanish clients on here, and furthermore to Irwin Mitchells and various others. So the information I discuss today on a tax perspective should be taken initially as information only. The reason I say that is because I don't know your situation in detail in terms of where your domicile, where you're resident, what's your background, how long have you been in the country where you are. I don't know where your assets are based. There's a lot of factors need to be taken into consideration before you take the tax advice as a gospel, and then the financial advice as gospel. So today is going to be an open discussion on some of the things that I see emerging a lot in previous case studies I've had with new clients coming on, a lot of my existing clients who are retiring, and I'm sure that most of you in the call will find some points useful. Sometimes my webinars may raise some more answers than questions. I had that feedback once. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, probably not. But it's very hard for me to cover off every aspect on a 30-minute call. So I'm going to hone in on the key topics. And as I said before, listen, I do discovery meetings for no charge. So if anyone wants to have a meeting after this webinar, ask more questions, tell me a little bit more about yourself, maybe just initially see if there's any ways I can assist you, then of course just reach out to me on email or call, and we'll be happy to have just a kind of short 30, 40, 1 hour call, Teams call, video call, face-to-face call, just to face-to-face meeting, just to understand your position better. Right, the autumn budget. Rachel Reeves. Of course, Labour had their first budget for many years, just back in autumn 2024, and there was a whole host of changes, from personal tax to business tax to wages, wages, benefits and pensions, excuse me. We had transport, we had drinking and smoking, we had government spending, housing, and lots of other stuff. We could talk about the fact that UK capital gains tax is increasing from 10 to 18% for basic rate payers on shares. We could talk about how it's going from 20 to 24% for higher rate taxpayers in the UK. We could discuss the fact that national insurance is going up to 15% on salaries above £5,000 for anyone that has companies in the UK, or is an employer in the UK and has staff. Or we could talk about the fact that the duty on private jets is going up by 50% for anyone who has the luxury of flying with private jets. But to be honest, we're not going to go through the full budget. I'm raising some points here that some of you may be relevant to, but I want to really focus on three key aspects from that budget, which I feel is probably the most important. Well, not that I feel, that I know has been the most important query, particularly for my clients that I have at the moment who are British or have British ties, working or retired overseas, and are looking to get the best advice around how to structure their assets, from succession planning, from income drawdown planning, or perhaps repatriation if they're moving around between different tax positions. And those three points are here. So what matters most for high net worth Brits living abroad from the budget /year? Number one, UK pensions to be added to the inheritable estate come April 2027. So what does that mean? What that means is that UK pensions, which were typically out with the scope of inheritance tax if you died before the age of 75, will now be subject to inheritance tax on death come April 2027. Big change. And I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. Change number 2, the abolition of non-dom status on inheritance tax, 2025, coming into effect this year, and has been replaced by new residence rules. For anyone who's aware, inheritance tax from a UK point of view, so I'm talking to everyone that's British on the call, from a UK standpoint, is the only tax until this year which has followed your citizenship, your bloodline, not your residence. So what that means is if you're a British passport holder, your father was British, it kind of follows that, kind of written in old law, legal law, it's your father's bloodline, then you are a domiciled British citizen. What that means is that even when you move abroad, even if you're abroad for many, many, many years, it's very hard to lose your non-domicility status. You will pay 40% inheritance tax on your worldwide assets, not just UK. Those were the rules that have been in place for decades. This is the biggest change that we'll see probably on inheritance tax and the generation of my clients, to be honest. And I'm talking a lot about retirees here. So what they're doing is they're changing that domicility test for inheritance to a residence test, which again I'll come to on a couple of slides in more detail. And then the third change, which is relevant for people who think they're going to go back to the UK at some point. For people that are planning to stay outside of the UK in Portugal, Spain, or other places for forever and not really touch back from a tax perspective in the UK, this doesn't really apply to you. But for anyone who is thinking about going back to the UK, and I find actually, there's always that door's always ajar. It's more than 50% of people that I meet, they leave that door ajar in case it becomes fruitful. Well, this new rule may be fruitful for some people. This is the Foreign Income and Gains. People are calling it FIG. Don't really like the acronym, but Foreign Income and Gains rules, which will be brought in to replace the old remittance rules. And again, that comes into effect April 2025. 3 key things that the rest of the webinar this evening will focus on. Apologies if your key aspect is not on here, but I think when I go into a little bit more detail around some wealth planning techniques for different countries, you may find that you get some value at the end regardless. So, first point, UK pensions are going to be added to the inheritable estate come April 2027. What that means is that, look, inheritance tax in the UK has been a huge burden for British people in the UK and actually overseas for since day dot. It's one of the highest and most strenuous regimes for tax across the entire globe. Of course, you have your nil band rates. If you're a married couple, you have 325,000 plus 325,000, so you get 650,000, which is non-taxable. And of course, you've got your residence nil rate band as well, 300 grand. So you get about 950,000 typically, which is not subject to tax. But anything above that 950 in the UK then is subject to a 40% tax on your estate, unless it is structured into the wealth planning techniques and different types of assets. But one of the biggest planning tools that people were using for many, many years was to stack up their pensions. UK pensions, self-invested personal pensions, defined contributions, money purchase, and of course, some people may still have defined benefits in the UK as well, which we can talk about another day. Now, those pensions, let's talk about a self-invested personal pension, are now subject to IHT on death come 2027. So that benefit and that succession plan of passing that down to kids and having that proportion of your estate has now gone. It seems if we go back to the Conservative rule just towards the end of their term, they abolished the lifetime allowance. For anyone who's got a pension in the UK above 1 million, you probably know what lifetime allowance is, or in fact, more people may as well. Lifetime allowance was effectively a wealth tax on pensions, which was if you had above 1.05 million in a pension, 1.05 million, then you would be taxed an additional 25% on everything above the 1.05. And that actually used to be 25% above 1.25, 1.5, 1.7. It kind of gradually came down over time, a bit more beneficial to clients. The Conservative government came out in a bit of a shock. I think it was the end of 2023. They just abolished it completely. So what that means is that there was no longer, and is still no longer, a wealth tax on pensions above 1.05. They just completely scrapped it. Labour decided not to come into power and just put that back on. I think what they've done, probably rather intelligently, is they've decided just to put pensions into inheritance tax, which is a bit sneaky because you think about the previous tax, the wealth tax, the lifetime allowance, it was 25% above 1.05. Labour have just says, well, all pensions are now subject to 40% tax if someone dies on the basis, sorry, your residence nil bands of 950 have been used up on other assets such as property, cash, and other investments. So interesting. I mean, I remember watching the budget live, and I just felt like there was a lot of detail about other topics, and I felt like this one, Rachel Reeves kind of just threw it in. It was almost I had to message one of my colleagues and say, did that just happen? Because it's a huge change, an enormous change, and it's really there's some people when that lifetime allowance got scrapped have just been stacking their pensions. There's a lot of people who've designed their plan around, pensions with 2-3 million in UK pensions, which now are completely going to be tested for IHT upon well come April 2027. So there's some really strong elements to consider there about how those pensions or assets should be structured, um, over the next few years coming into after April 2027. And again, that will actually depend on where you're resident, because we need to consider not just UK tax, but the tax regimes in the countries you're based, Spain, Portugal, or otherwise, and also the changes on the residence rules, which I'm just about to come to in a moment. I hope that's clear. Again, any questions, feel free to reach out to us after the webinar. The second point is the abolition of the non-dom status on inheritance tax and the replacement with new residence rules. So what this means, and I'll explain it as clearly as I can. So as I mentioned before on the previous slide, inheritance tax is the only tax that follows your citizenship. So for example, until this year, 2025, if someone was living in Spain for 10 years, I had a lot of Spanish assets, property, cash, Spanish bonds, different types of vehicles, pensions. Despite the fact that you've been in Spain for 10 years and you've got a lot of assets there, the UK HMRC, upon your death, would still tax your UK estate, any UK previous assets, and also your worldwide and global estate from an IHT point of view. And they are extremely thorough. It's one of the biggest ways they recoup taxes. There's a lot of very famous cases of people celebrities trying to move to Switzerland and lose their domicile status by staying there for 15 of the last 20 years and getting local citizenship. But more often than not, the cases fall into the favour of HMRC and they do get their tax. So, bit of background there. What's happening now this year is that is being changed completely. So inheritance tax in the UK is no longer going to follow your citizenship. It is now going to follow residence entirely. That's good news by the way, for any British people on this call who are planning to stay overseas for a long period of time. In fact, it's fantastic news. What it means is that now, if you've spent more than 10 years outside the UK, pretty much a 10-year test either way. But let's talk about some of you on the call who are living in Spain and Portugal. If you've spent 10 years outside the UK or planning to spend 10 years outside the UK, after that 10 years is finished, you now will only pay UK inheritance tax on your UK-based assets. not on your worldwide assets. On the flip side to that, if there are prof expats, professionals, retirees who are from perhaps Europe, from the Middle East, from Asia, from different places, if you're living in the UK, you are now subject to inheritance tax on your UK assets if you've been there for 10 years. So I guess the Labour government are probably looking at it as, what's in my view, they're looking at it probably from, look how many, internationals are living in, and perhaps just look at London alone. And a lot of these internationals own blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of flats, right? That's the reality. They're probably looking at it saying these people have been here for 10, 15, 20 years. And actually, we should be getting inheritance tax on those assets. And they're probably looking at that pocket, that bulk of wealth versus the kind of expat community. And they've decided to make a huge decision to switch because as I said, it's a generational change, a huge change from domicile to residence. So, a very interesting point. You can I can imagine that some of your brains are already the activities picked up a little bit on if you're planning to stay outside the UK for the long term or have been for the long term. Is it time to start thinking about restructuring those UK assets a little better? Because any UK assets will still be subject to IHT. With all due respect, if you have a flat in London, that pretty much uses up your residence nil rate band at 950 normally. So any assets above that, any other property, any other cash, any other bonds, any other pensions, all of that's going to be subject to 40%. So it's starting to think now, well, where am I basing now? If there's options, if it seems like it's feasible from a tax perspective, from a restructuring perspective, from a insurance and growth and income producing perspective, maybe I should be starting to think about reducing my UK exposure because your worldwide assets don't have that 40% tax, albeit you do still have to consider the country you're resident in. But rest assured, none of these countries are anywhere near as high as the UK, and some of them are actually extremely favourable, which I'll come to at the end of the webinar. Right, third point is the foreign income and gains rules, FIG rules, to replace the old remittance rules, and this is again coming into effect this year, April 2025. So for any people who are non-British on the call and have spent time in the UK, you'll be quite familiar with the non-dom rules. These are being replaced completely by this new rule, this new regime, the foreign income and gains rules. The foreign income and gains rule, this slide, by the way, is only relevant if you're planning to go to the UK or back to the UK. All right. The regime, well, first, the first thing to consider in the regime is if you've been a non-UK resident in the last 10 years, again, just coincidentally a 10-year rule, if you've been non-UK resident for the last 10 years and decide to go back to the UK, for the first 4 years from that tax year, you will have 100% relief on any foreign income and gains coming into the country. So if you've got international pensions, international investment vehicles, platforms, life assurance bonds, anything really of any structure, even kind of foreign property, albeit, again, be wary of double taxation agreements because always two tax to consider. If you move back to UK and you decide, well, look, time to restructure, I'm going to be back in the UK long term, you want to start thinking about, pulling out and restructuring as much as you can in those first 4 years, given the fact you've got 100% relief on that coming in. Because after that 4 years, guess what? Majority of the time it will be localised tax treatment in the UK, depending on whether it's a favourable DTA, but majority of the time it's localised tax treatment in the UK, and everyone knows that you've got your 20, 40, 45% bands. Most people on this call would be up at the additional rate of 45% income tax, so majority of their income coming in, or 40% high. And of course, you've got your capital gains tax, which just went up to 24% for high rate taxpayers. So the fact that you're getting full relief on that for a 4 year window is something to really consider and start planning for as early as you can, because there's always an element of, where my passion lies, understanding the cross-border aspects. The Swiss tax regime, the Spanish tax regime, the Portuguese tax regime are all entirely different. All right, and they're all entirely different from the UK, and they treat assets in a different way from which each other country does. So it's understanding that, and I actually find if you're planning to move back to the UK, you should start planning now, because where you hold your assets before you go back to UK is equally as important as how you draw them down in the UK. So, it's not just about being tax optimized for where you are now, it's about being tax optimized for the future, and likewise, and vice versa, it's been tax optimized for where you think you're going, but then restructuring where you are to fit with that model. I hope that's relatively clear. Okay, those are the three key points from the budget. These are the three key points that have been a huge focus for my clients over the last kind of 4 or 5 months, in terms of understanding them, making changes already, to be quite frank, restructuring things already. And I would like to just kind of touch on some of those points and some of the things we have been doing, because I feel they'll be relevant to some people on the call, albeit maybe not everyone. And this is my next slide. Well, with planning around these changes, and this will be the last topic of this evening. So if you're starting to fade, if I've lost your attention, perhaps tuning back in would be a good idea, because this part is going to be talking a little bit about different countries and things to consider with each country. Again, I'm going to keep it very bird's eye, very top level. Quite frankly, it's impossible to go into each aspect, each asset, each country in a lot of detail, even on a 2-hour call, never mind a 1 hour. But again, as I said before, if you would like to get a bit more information and just have an initial discovery meeting, share a little bit more about your position, perhaps we can establish whether I can add a little bit more value to your situation. Right. Oh, let's pull all these countries up. So let's talk a little bit top level information about each country and some of the things that I'm considering at the moment with each country. We have Portugal top left, Spain in the middle, UK at the top. Probably for majority of people on this call, those top three will be most important. I'm just going to shed a little bit of light on Switzerland, Germany, France as well at the bottom. Some other countries I've got a lot of experience and clients in, but let's focus on the top three more so initially. Portugal top left. There's quite a lot of people on this call from Portugal. So things to consider with Portugal is we've spoke a lot about a UK standpoint. All right, but Portugal has been a very favourable regime and a very attractive place for expats all over the world, actually, not just the UK. And the reason for that is they've had a non-habitual residence regime in place since September 2009. Non-habitual residence basically means that if you've been outside of Portugal for 5 years or never been in Portugal, if you decide to move there, you actually get 10 years of tax relief on your foreign income and investments. So if you were lucky enough to sign up before March 2020 with the NHR regime, you get 0% tax on all foreign income for the next 10 years of the date of you signing. If you're after March 2020, then you had a 10% tax on foreign income coming into the country, and there's no tax on your dividends either. That is a well, you can see where this is going. If you're on that regime currently, congratulations, because it's now pretty much closed. The Costa, the previous man in charge in Portugal, he abolished it just before he resigned due to I think it was due to fraud around lithium batteries or something rather unusual. But he resigned shortly after. But they held up the decree. They abolished it for new entries. Now the new entries we've got some people who are trying to push some applications through before March this year, but in order to get that application through, you had to already have a residence card, or prove that you've been in the country for the last few years. So they're kind of on that last application. After that, there will be no more access to the favourable NHR. There is a new NHR 2.0. They're calling it 2.0. I think that's a bit cheeky because it doesn't really carry anywhere near the same benefits as what the first one did. Right, why am I saying Portugal? Because if you're in Portugal, you're planning to be there long term, you should be thinking about, well, if I still have UK investments and UK holdings, but I'm on a favourable NHR regime right now in Portugal for a period of 10 or 5 or 7 years left, I should really be thinking about restructuring my assets as best I can whilst I'm on this favourable regime, particularly now that UK pensions are going to be subject to IHT, that UK assets are probably still being subject to some local tax treatment if you've got property, etc. there. One thing that I'm doing a lot with individuals is about, you know, UK pensions are completely subject to income tax on drawdown. In fact, all pensions are subject to income tax on drawdown. On the full pot, your contributions, your growth, everything is subject to income tax. Now, drawing that down during your NHR is great because you're paying 0 or 10% income, happy days. But after NHR in Portugal, Portugal has the highest band of 48% tax on income, localised. It obviously goes from 13.5 up to 48 in different bands. But that's 6% higher than the European average of 42. So it's right up there with your Belgiums and some other countries, some part of Scandinavia, really. So you should be really thinking about trying to restructure your pensions, your assets to be IHT more efficient, because a lot of Portugal calls it succession tax, gift tax. There's a lot of vehicles you can do in Portugal where there's no gift tax. So you should be thinking about restructuring, drawing down as much of that pension as you can whilst you're on a 0 or 10% income. Get it all out, get it all net of tax, because you don't want to pay 48% on the full thing or later down the line. Get it into a personal vehicle, get it restructured for succession, get it restructured for long-term capital gains. And obviously there's different vehicles in Portugal you can use. Some of the more favourable ones are like your kind of localised European bonds, ICAE. Portugal recognise it as ICAE. My Scottish accent's getting in the way. India, Charlie, Alpha, Echo, ICAE bonds. These bonds are quite widely used in Portugal because they can hold. They're not bonds in the sense of fixed income. They actually just platforms that hold, you know, equities, fixed deposits, investment bonds, commodities. But you can hold them, and you can then draw down in Portugal. The reason why people like them is because you only pay tax on the growth, and if you hold it for 8 years, you only pay 11.2%, which is a 60% exemption from the standard capital gains tax rates in Portugal of 28%. So things to think about for anyone who's planning to be in Portugal long term on structures and how, particularly around your kind of UK assets, and if you're on an NHR regime. Conscious of the time, people, I'm running a bit over, but Spain, there's a lot of people on this call from Spain. Spain's obviously a cantonal tax system, similar to Switzerland, whereby each area has its own tax regime, from controlling income tax, wealth tax, capital gains, and other parts as well. Now, goes without saying that the highest tax areas and cantons are in the south of Spain. Why? Because that's where most foreigners are based. That's where us Brits tend to go to sunbathe, to buy our retirement homes, and to walk around the beach. Whereas if you compare that to like perhaps Madrid, that tends to be where some of your lowest taxes are based. So things to consider with Spain is perhaps where you're setting up your primary residence, is where you're going to be based. Some planning, if you're planning to move to Spain long term, you want to really consider some of these aspects. Things with Spain that are really important, and everyone's probably seen the news recently, that they're planning to bring in 100% property tax, which looks like it's going to be pushed through. What that means is if you're buying a property in Spain, you don't already have one, you effectively pay the same price of the property again in tax, 100%. So if you're buying a €750,000 property, the tax would be €750,000 on top, completely deterring the that's for non-EU citizens, by the way, which Brits obviously come into, non-EU, not for people who are EU citizen. So what that means is that they're pretty much kind of driving. They want to drive the property prices back down and make it more affordable for locals. That's the rationale they've given anyway. But that's new news. On other news, Beckham's law still exists in Spain. All right, important, really important. So if you've been outside, again, outside the UK for 5 years, you can actually come into Spain on the basis that you are working or have a corporation or you're kind of registered in Spain and your foreign income and gains again are not taxable for a period thereafter. And again, that makes it really important for people who are planning to be or move to Spain to understand that and get your assets structured as best you can and use that period of time to draw down as much as you can and then reinvest thereafter for the future. The UK, obviously you've got the new FIG rules, which we've covered. A lot of people well, in the UK, offshore bonds are quite handy now. They're becoming a lot more attractive, given the fact that UK capital gains tax allowances have went from 12k to 3k. If you've already, kind of maxed out your pensions, you don't want to put any more money into pensions because of inheritance tax rules, to be quite frank. A lot of people are now using kind of your offshore bonds to stack up some additional wealth. Offshore bonds are widely used because they're UK compatible. And you get these kind of key tax benefits where you get tax-free gross roll-up on all investments and income within it. You get a 5% drawdown each year tax-free. So if you get 1 million in the bond, you get 50 grand a year tax-free out of it, 2 million, 100 grand a year, which you can draw down over a period of 20 years. That's really handy for additional rate taxpayers to kind of mitigate and reduce some of their income tax exposure. And you've also got time apportionment relief for time spent outside the UK. You can gift and segment within, and obviously trust planning is a big thing in the UK as well. Again, try not to confuse when I say offshore bonds and Portuguese bonds with debt instruments. These are just platforms, investments. They're given the name bonds. It's almost financial jargon from many, many years ago, but they are platforms where they've got a kind of assured wrap around them and you can draw down. Trust planning is still very big in the UK. Again, you wouldn't use trusts in a lot of countries here, particularly France. Switzerland doesn't really recognise Portugal. So I'm talking about the UK, but trust planning is a big factor. It's been a big factor always for IHT and drawdown succession planning, and something that's still very widely used. The bottom three, just skimming over the top, Switzerland's also a cantonal tax system. Each canton has its own tax regime, so be aware of that. Be aware of where your assets are based in the canton they're in. Be aware of the residence of your canton, because quite often people have assets in Zurich, but they're living in Zug, or they have assets in Zurich, they're living in Geneva. So things to consider there. They've obviously got a three-pillar system in Switzerland. The good thing about Switzerland is that actually, across the board, the tax regime's pretty good. You've got a very flexible pension system where you can transfer between vested benefits. You can draw out all your assets if you leave the country. That's quite attractive depending on the DT of the country you're going to next. Because if you go to the UK, you've got a Swiss pension. The UK sets taxing rates in Switzerland if you take it as a lump sum. So quite often, your clients will be taking out their pensions for 4.5% tax if you structure it correctly. You get your pension into a canton like Zug or Schweiz, and then you draw it down correctly in a lump sum format in the UK. So a lot of planning around that. Of course, your income tax, your inheritance tax is very low in Switzerland, and but you do have a wealth tax, which is something to consider. Mainly, it's going to be quite an expensive place for high net worths if you're wanting to retire there and you're not earning there. The healthcare system isn't cheap, albeit it's very, very good, and the wealth tax can be a bit of a burden as well. Same with France, it's got a wealth tax at the same time, albeit France is actually high in tax everywhere. I'm going to put Germany and France together here. I would say historically, and just the kind of nature of their countries, a lot more socially run. What I mean by that is the taxes are high, they're very rigid, there's not much planning around them, they don't give much leeway or much relief. So where am I getting at with this? Don't retire. In Germany and France, if tax planning is your objective, look at somewhere else. Excuse me. However, that's not always the case because people have emotional ties to these countries. They want to be there for reasons such as perhaps their kids are there, or perhaps they have, parents there or family there. So, France, HNWIs are widely used. Obviously, a very good pension and social system. Their government pensions are great. Government pensions are great as well. You know, they're not tied, and these pensions can go up to, Switzerland, 4.5 grand a month for a married couple. France, I've seen pensions at 2, 3 grand a month just from the government. So there are benefits, albeit France, in terms from an income standpoint, income tax flat rate of 30% tax on gains is quite expensive and quite hard to structure assets, and it takes a big chunk of your retirement net income. Germany, I've got here because the German property market's booming. You know, your Leipzig and Berlin are two countries which are quite in high demand. There's a lot of new developments being put up, very, very, very low vacancy rates, a good rental income. It's projected that over the next 10 years, these property prices will double, if not much more. And the other attraction there is if you hold a property for 10 years in Germany and you sell it, after 10 years, there's no tax on the gains in Germany. So depending on where you're planning to be resident next, again, also important to consider the DTA, double taxation agreement. It can be quite attractive prospect if you're looking for different alternative ways to invest your money, particularly in the property market for income and growth. It's very, very efficient for ease of access to loans. Obviously, it's in euros. The government doesn't put many barriers up, and you obviously get some good rental yields and cap accumulation. I say that because it's becoming harder and harder to buy property in different countries. Spain, well, if you're non-EU citizen, you're going to have 100% tax on the top. The UK have just raised their stamp duty from 3 to 5%, which is making it a little bit more attractive. The UK, obviously, UK properties are subject to capital gains tax, income tax on the rent, and then it's subject to inheritance tax on death. So, and then France makes it really hard to build any property portfolio. They don't want people to have property portfolios, so they are very high taxes as well. So if you're looking for ways to build property portfolios, you need to be quite careful about the countries you do it in. Um, I hope everyone's taken something from this evening. I do appreciate that when I'm kind of rhyming out facts like this, that they can raise more questions, and that's okay. And these are things that you should be thinking about. These are things that I hope that you take on board. And as I said again, I repeat, if you'd like to have a brief introduction conversation, feel free to reach out to us. All right. These are a lot of the companies that we work with. You'll recognize most of the names from a kind of investment point of view: LGT, Utmost, Lombard, Vanguard, Novia, Seas Bank, Switzerland, Generali. I mean, the list, I could have put 6 slides up here and it still wouldn't have covered our core partners. Okay, look, no questions this evening through the system. I find it's more worthwhile if people want to just have a kind of brief conversation directly. Just feel free to reach out to me here, because then I actually understand your position and my answers will be accurate and relevant to you. Listen, everyone, have a great start to the year. That is our new year, new rules webinar. I have some more webinars coming up. For anyone who's based in Portugal and Spain, there'll be another webinar coming up in April and May, mainly around specifically to NHR planning, wealth planning, and also around kind of Beckham's Law and areas of Spain. So look out for those on our socials. Feel free to join those ones, or if you'd like to know more information sooner, just reach out. Thank you everyone for joining. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a good start to 2025.